find such a love at our age. Whoever thought we could dance on
Welcome to
a
Couples Therapy in 7 Words. I'm your co-host, Judy Alexander, and I'm here with my husband, Dr. Bruce Chalmers.
Hello, Judy. Hello, viewers and listeners. Judy, what's today's episode?
Sex Therapy for Older Adults, an interview with Dr. Jenn Kennedy.
And we just talked with Dr. Jenn Kennedy, and yet another great interview. What can I say?
Had a lot of interesting things to say.
A lot of interesting things to say, and she is specializes in sex therapy and works with not just older adults, but we are the focus of our conversation was pretty much that. Before we get there, let us talk about some of our stuff. What should we talk about?
Well, since my book came up during the conversation,
It did. Let's talk about
my
it.
nose is so itchy. Yes, that would be the Blue Tent, Erotic Tales from the Bible. So if you're having sexual issues and want to bring erotica into your life, even if you're not having issues and you want to bring erotica just to mix it up, this is a good primer.
It's in your pseudonym, which is Laria Zilber.
Yes,
That's what you
Laria
can search
Zilber.
for. The Blue Tent Erotic Tales from the Bible by Laria Zilber came up in the context of our conversation with Dr. Kennedy because she was mentioning one of the topics she brings up with the couples she works with is using erotica.
Right.
And so I just jumped in there and said, "Oh,
Right.
Judy wrote a book
Yes,
of erotica."
erotica can have a very important place in your sex life.
Absolutely. And there's some other books that I happen to have written.
Well, why don't we start with Reigniting the Spark, Why Stable Relationships Lose Intimacy and How to Get It Back.
And that was the first one of my couples therapy books that came out a few years ago.
Right.
And that actually came up in our conversation with Dr. Kennedy too, because I mentioned I have a chapter in there called Sex, Good Sex, and Sacred Sex, which has often come up in conversations with
I'm not
folks
sure
over
if
the
that was
years.
on the air, though.
Oh,
that
maybe it
came
wasn't.
up.
No, it might not
That
have come
might
up.
have-
Yeah.
yeah.
Actually, and that might have been after we stopped recording
Right.
with her. So now you folks know that. There's an interview. There is a chapter in that book about that.
Right. And
then
then
the next
there's
book,
your next book, It's Not About Communication, Why Everything You Know About Couples Therapy is Wrong.
and that's more about the process of couples therapy itself and how to make use of it, and also has a bunch of stuff in there about ideas and ideologies. And I think that's important for our general understanding. Ideologies has caused a lot of, the whole concept of ideology has caused a lot of problems.
Sure has.
Yes.
And your latest book, Betrayal and Forgiveness, How to Navigate the Turmoil and Learn to Trust Again.
And that book is the one, most recent and selling pretty well. And I invite people to go find those books. So without further ado, let's get on with our interview, and we'll see you on the other side.
Our guest today is Dr. Jenn Kennedy. After working as a publicist and freelance journalist, Dr. Kennedy earned a master's in clinical psychology and a PhD in clinical sexology and is a board-certified sex therapist. Dr. Kennedy has been working with individuals and couples in the area of sexual satisfaction, dysfunction, and interpersonal communication for 8 years. She offers small group programs as well as one-on-one intensives. Dr. Kennedy also has considerable experience working with LGBT individuals and couples. She supervises up-and-coming therapists and operates Riviera Therapy in Santa Barbara, California. She also hosts the podcast Pleasure Project, Sex and Relationships. Jenn, welcome to Couples Therapy in 7 Words.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Well, it's great to have you. So we always like to start out with our guests asking, how did you get into the work that you do? Tell us something about your own journey.
Yeah, I went back to grad school kind of later in life. I was 40 and I knew I wanted to see couples. Like that was I had been through a lot of couples therapy and therapy in general, and I was always intrigued by it and, kind of felt like I did it sort of unofficially with a lot of my friends, and I wanted to have more, clinical training, but couples was my focus. And then as I started seeing more couples, I realized sex is really a deficit. So many therapists don't really get much training and don't have a lot of comfort working around sexuality. And so that was a really good niche for me, and it's proven to be great. It's a good fit.
Yeah, I always like to tell this particular anecdote when when that issue of therapists not being comfortable talking about sex comes up. I was
Yeah.
at a continuing education training I don't know, a couple years ago, a year and a half ago, and it was for couples therapists. It wasn't specifically about sex therapy, but the trainer, and there were maybe 150 of us on Zoom. It was a pretty big session.
Mhm.
And the trainer did a little survey and said, okay, how many of you will ask couples about their sex life in the first or second session? And I'm sitting there thinking, well, of course. I mean, obviously. And
Yeah.
I think it was about a third. And
Yeah.
the other folks were saying things like, oh, no, I wait for them to bring it up.
Mhm.
Seriously? Wow.
Yeah.
And of course, that's, as you point out, many, many therapists aren't comfortable talking about sex at all.
I taught the human sexuality class in a grad program for about 5 years, and I was shocked at how uncomfortable, and this is the last quarter of their whole grad program, and how uncomfortable most of the students were talking about sex.
Yeah.
Amazing.
And I was pretty clear that some people gravitated to it and were very interested, but most of them were like, I don't want to talk about, because a lot of grad school is kind of looking through your own history, and they didn't want to talk about any of it. And I was
Yeah.
like, ooh, how's that going to go in the room? When they sit with patients that need
Mhm.
that work done. So
Yeah, and they need to
there's
feel
a
comfortable.
signaling. There's a signaling that happens. I do it on my paperwork, my intake paperwork, because I want them to know from, out of the gates that this is up for discussion. It's
Mhm.
important.
Yeah.
Yeah, if they can't be comfortable talking about sex, how are they going to function as therapists?
I mean, there's a lot of other topics that come up, but sex
Mhm.
is sort of with couples work in particular, it's always there. It's a part of the partnership. So
Mhm.
yeah, I think it's necessary.
Yeah. I like to point out to folks, it's not that sex is perfectly correlated with intimacy in general, but it is
Mhm.
correlated. And
Mhm.
so often, if they're doing well in the sexual department, they're often, not always, but often doing well in intimacy more generally. And vice versa. If they're doing well in intimacy more generally, they're probably at least able to talk about sex and deal with things as it happens. So,
It's interesting to me though that some couples aren't necessarily doing so well. They have great sex, they can get off, but they don't
mm,
have intimacy, right?
yes.
So their sex life can be intact, but they don't particularly like each other or know each other very well. So
Yeah.
that's always an interesting twist of it, but it feels like two people that are more like getting off on one another rather than connecting and sort of having their sex life be, a vehicle for intimacy.
Yeah.
Do you
Yeah.
find that with older couples as well that have been together for a long time?
In that configuration, like it's pretty interesting actually. I would say couples that are like maybe 45 or 50 plus are a very different profile than younger couples for lots of reasons, including technology. But in those older couples, unfortunately, I think there's been sort of a gender role that has happened, and a lot of the heterosexual couples anyway, the women are not terribly satisfied, but they also haven't advocated for their own pleasure. And
Mm,
so they sort of put up with it, but they don't necessarily like the quality of the sex, but they also
Mhm.
haven't articulated what they do want. So those couples aren't necessarily like both coming together and getting off. It's rather that, they're kind of getting through it, because the men tend to have a pretty active interest in sex appetite throughout the lifespan. And I find that a lot of women above 50 are just like, no thanks. Right.
I'm
And so
done.
it's just,
yeah.
that's a
Yeah.
lot of who's coming in to see me actually is that
Uh,
profile.
yeah. And,
So,
and it's often something of a shock to the men to
mhm.
discover, one of the reasons she may not be interested in is, and, I don't generally like to sort of over characterize things to people, or certainly not to insult people, but a lot of times it's because the guy has no clue how to have sex with her in a way that she'll enjoy.
Well, that's because she hasn't spoken up
And
all those
often,
years.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been this like pattern that sort of got reinforced. And, you know, part of this is that she doesn't maybe know what she even wants. Like she hasn't
Mhm.
they haven't had that conversation because she hasn't really had it with herself. And so it's been this repetition of the same go-to, and it's not that satisfying. So it's not that she doesn't like sex, it's that she doesn't like the sex they've been having.
Yes.
So that's a different conversation that actually has somewhere to go versus
Hmm.
just, I think a lot of women get labeled with menopause and then game over, but I think there's more to it than that.
Mhm. Yeah, I've often quoted David Schnarch, if you
Mhm.
remember him. And he died not that long ago. I guess it was fairly. I don't think it was of COVID, but he died early in the COVID era. But he used to say he would when he would give talks to people, um, he would ask, "At what age do you think people reach their sexual peak, men and women respectively?" And
Mhm.
the usual answers would be, well, it must be that women older than men, but men in their 20s and women in their 30s or something like that. And he would say, no, I think both men and women reach their sexual peak in their 60s and 70s.
Mhm.
And he
Mhm.
obviously wasn't talking about sexual gymnastics,
Right.
the ability to bend into certain positions. How can I say this without getting too personal? Definitely goes down with age. Let me just put it that way. You get aches and pains in
It's
places you
not as
didn't used to have them.
flexible.
Not as
Much
flexible.
better.
But he's talking about maturity. He's
Yeah.
talking about the ability, among other things, to be able to talk about it without freaking out.
Yeah.
And that level of maturity, and what Schnarch used to talk about was the level of maturity necessary to tolerate the anxiety of extreme desire, which
Yeah.
is not easy to do.
And sustained intimacy.
Yeah.
It's like there's a wonderful book called Magnificent Sex that came out maybe 2 years ago. Peggy Klein Platz was the co-author, and I interviewed her. In that book, they interviewed a bunch of couples that are together long term, like 20 to 40 years together. Everyone's over 60. And it's really a great book for couples that are a little bit older because they're asking them what makes magnificent sex. And it's a very different conversation when you're in a longer term relationship, when you've got aches and pains, when you've got other considerations, right? And you've gone through maybe parenting and, you know, health
Menopause.
stuff and menopause
Mhm.
and all of it, right? It's to stay together, to choose to continue to engage in a joyful sexual relationship it is a choice. And I think it's a mindset too, you
Mhm.
know, and hopefully your ego is in check, your
Mhm.
curiosity is up, you know? Yeah.
So
It's
you
different.
work a lot with older couples. So can you talk about some of the issues that come up with working with older couples? We talked a little bit about it, but what are some
Yeah,
of that?
it's
What are
interesting
issues?
that I mean, I've got several couples in their 70s, and there is an existential component to that of like, am I still relevant? Does
Mm.
this like sex sometimes can be a strange like shorthand for relevancy or desire, am I desired? Am I important? Do I matter? And so sometimes that changes the conversation because, maybe there's starting to be some dysfunction, maybe there's some erectile dysfunction, or maybe there's a lot of pain with, penetration. So the conversation then shifts towards how else can we, like, what is the goal of sex and how else can we reach that goal?
Mm.
Um, and those older couples are typically used to having very traditional, you know, penis in vagina sex. And so having a new conversation about how like all the erogenous zones and all the other ways that you can have really satisfying connection and intimacy definitely comes up. That conversation we referenced earlier too, that this is more like the 50s where they're starting to empty nest and they're looking at kind of the new relationship after all the parenting responsibilities are gone. Maybe they're sandwiched between older parents they're taking care of and two. And so there's some of those stressors, but they've got financial resources, career is going well, but they're almost re-meeting each other and deciding if they still want to be together, right? They're not just doing the business of life, but they're trying to decide who are we now and
Mhm.
what do we like and can we um, reinvent this partnership.
Mm.
So that tends to be more the 50s time period.
So that's more of an emotional thing rather than a sexual issue. Is
Yeah, it the sex is commingled with that though, because I do
uh-huh.
think sex is a microcosm of the larger relationship quite often. And if there's respect, and if there's curiosity, and if there's um, good communication, if there's a desire to please one another, if there's a real appreciation, all of that is also showing up intimately.
Mm.
Mhm.
Yeah, and the ability to play, which can
Mhm.
often be really difficult when you encounter things you hadn't encountered before, obstacles, things that get
Yeah.
in the way, be it, erectile dysfunction or painful penetration or any of those sorts of things. The ability to recognize that it's worth it's worth thinking about that in order to still be able to play, that there's something sacred about that.
Yeah.
That's that phenomenon for older folks who are, what is sex all about? Well, among other things, sex is about is procreation, and you're done with that when you're over a certain age. Certain,
Yeah.
when women are past menopause, they ain't having more kids.
Hmm.
And obviously similarly for men who aren't interested in having more kids. And so what is it about? And there's a I think a spiritual aspect to it. The sense that, wow, there's something where you're getting in touch with larger forces, something very meaningful about the kind of connection you can have in a sexual relationship with someone that you've been with for a long time. That
Yeah.
that is, I don't know that it's available any other way.
Yeah, it's a point of differentiation, like that partnership versus friendships.
Mm-hmm.
But also, like, I think it is a recalibration. Sort of, we do it over and over again of like, what are we now? What does this serve? Because sex is optional, to your
Mm-hmm.
point, right? We're not trying to procreate when you're older. So you're coming together, and that's one of the questions I ask pretty early on is like, what is the function of sex for you?
Mm.
Because making that more, and it doesn't have to be the same answer, for the same person all the time, but thinking about like, is this about connection? Is this about relational maintenance?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you just want to make your partner happy. So, and that'll do it. But hopefully that's not always the answer. Sometimes it's also, sometimes it's about, I just want to go to sleep, and this helps. It's like practical too, but
Yeah.
holding and the touching and the feeling like you matter to somebody, I think is also part of it. And that can be achieved without necessarily like having certain types of sex every time.
Mm-hmm.
So I think helping them articulate that changes the conversation in a productive way. And it takes the focus off having it always have to be, about the end goal. Because what I also find is that sometimes if women are feeling ambivalent about penetrative sex, they start to withdraw their affection. And so
Oh, yeah.
the husband's not getting their touch needs met at all because
Mm-hmm.
they don't want to signal like, oh, if I'm affectionate with you at all, you're going to think it's the whole thing. She's not ready for that. So then she doesn't give anything. And so I think having some flexibility around what does this mean, and usually it's helpful. It kind of removes the logjam,
Yeah.
of nothing happening.
Yeah, that's a real common pattern that I see as well. That phenomenon that if the woman, and almost always gendered in that direction, although actually I've seen variations in the other direction too, but
Mhm.
often it's exactly as you're saying, and the woman will often it sets up kind of a death spiral because
Mhm.
what happens is she will start to feel like, oh no, I'm going to be falsely encouraging him, and that's the last thing I want. And why does he only ever want sex? And he's feeling like, why does she keep rejecting me?
Yeah.
And so he gets grumpier. I'm not saying that, he has no responsibility there. He does, but he gets grumpier. She starts feeling like, well, he seems to be mad at me all the time. So what good is this? And then, things go down the tubes. So to be able to talk about that without freaking out, I've noted when both
Mhm.
parties feel that they're valid human beings, it's like,
Yeah.
it's okay that you feel that way. That's not a weird way to feel. I almost always say to every couple I meet about 20 minutes in, I have a usual first session stuff that I do with folks. After that, it's pretty much improv. But the first session is pretty structured. And about 20 minutes in, I almost always say, I can already tell since we're old buddies now, because I've known you for 20 minutes, that neither one of you is batshit crazy.
Mhm.
And that, and they already knew that. I trust they already knew that. And I will point out to them that I say that to almost every couple, but there have been a handful over the course of my 30 years of doing this, that every once in a while I don't say that because somebody is having a manic episode, or somebody's having undiagnosed schizophrenia or something like that. But typically they're not crazy, and yet they feel the way they feel. And just to know that, often they'll smile and they'll
Mhm.
relax a little, and then they'll start recognizing, oh, you're different from me, but that's okay. We can handle that. And then they
Yeah.
can actually, then
You
there's
know,
room.
it's so much of this is like little by little, like over the years, they've created these patterns that are largely unconscious and that are largely implicit and don't get a lot of discussion. And so unpacking it and unraveling it in couples therapy is and specifically sex therapy is an interesting process. Well, I did that because you did that, right? It's a lot of action reaction.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's like, and assumptions along the way. Like I assumed this meant that when it didn't, or it meant it once, but it doesn't mean it always. And so starting to like put some room in that, some space to maybe consider something else or try something different is often the work.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things you've talked about, we were looking at your information and your website. You've talked about the role of anxiety, attachment, and ego in sexual strategy. I'm curious if you'd like to expand on that.
Yeah. So anxiety is a huge factor, mostly for men, but also sometimes for women, because there is this performative expectation.
Mm-hmm.
And once a man has any sort of erectile dysfunction, boy, it's like a feedback loop where they just get so worried that it's going to happen again. It's kind of like a panic attack, where
Yeah,
then once
and
it
it just
happens,
keeps feeding itself. And
yeah.
Well, and
So,
especially if the woman takes it personally, and you can tell me, and there's two women in this conversation, so I'm not going to mansplain to either one of you. You can tell me what your respective opinions. I've always thought there's an evolutionary piece to that there's an evolutionary piece to women taking that personally that is kind of part of the evolutionary heritage. It's a bummer. It's inaccurate. You know what I mean? The guy's penis isn't working the way he'd like it to. And if she says, "Oh my God, he's not attracted to me anymore," and you could say, "Well, gee, she shouldn't take it personally." But you guys aren't crazy either, says the guy here. You know what I mean? I think there's something to that, but I'm curious what your thoughts are about that.
I do see that oftentimes initially, but with time, I think typically she starts to, and I don't love either version because I don't want it to be his problem.
Mm-hmm.
I think sometimes it can be a biological issue,
Yes.
with blood flow and that type of thing. But
medical.
oftentimes it's just anxiety, so it becomes a relational issue.
Yeah.
So and I coach, how can she react to it in a way that feels, neutralizing so that he has somewhere to go? How can they redirect to try something else so it's not game over? Because a lot of times his anxiety spikes and her anxiety spikes too, because then sometimes she feels like she has to take over and be performative or
Yeah.
enjoy it so much or give him a good experience still. And sometimes she's disappointed because she was hoping for penetration, or sometimes she's like at a loss because now she has to recalibrate and do something else that wasn't the plan.
Yeah.
So I've seen a lot of like reactivity around that particular dynamic. And it does feel like it's unnecessary because it is ego, and it is sort of forcing the idea that it can only look this one way. And there's so much room to have something else. Like I
If
said,
they're not freaking out. It's
yeah,
really all about they're not freaking out. Yeah.
I had a conversation yesterday with a couple, and the man he has pronies, and so he's having some issues. He's had some shrinkage, and he also, just has some issue and some fear about size. And I said, look, would you rather have chronic lower back pain, or would you rather have pronies in your way? And he was like, I'd rather have what I have. And I was like, right?
Probably spoken as a guy who's experienced lower back pain.
Like, yeah,
Because most of us have, and it's like, oh yeah, no, I'd rather have mine be
yeah.
curved,
It's like this, look, we all get handed cards along the way, and it's like, that might be the card you were handed, but like you can, similar to chronic pain, you have to manage it. You have to do what you can, and then you have to like reconfigure your expectations and move forward with what you got.
Yeah.
Because if you're sitting in this, like, it's not fair, or diving into shame, right? That's a lot of
Yes.
times what happens is this like, oh my God, no, pull the eject seat and forget it. And then that feels bad to everybody.
Oh yeah.
And it doesn't have to. There's lots of ways to have really pleasing, pleasurable experience that don't have to include just that.
Now, of course, another thing that often comes up, and this is exposing other fault lines in the couple, is when the woman's reaction is not merely, oh, he doesn't find me attractive, when the woman's reaction is he's cheating. He's got to be cheating because it's always worked before, and now all of a sudden, I just had a couple of days ago I was talking with where that was there. I met them for the first time, and they were saying, yes, a couple of years ago, suddenly he wasn't interested in me anymore. And of course, his story is very different He didn't
Mhm.
think it was that abrupt. She experienced it as abrupt, was worried that he was cheating, seems to believe him that he's not, but still has that worry going on. So there's a lot of stuff that can come up.
Yeah, well, with men, there's this external validation or evidence of arousal,
Right.
Mhm.
whereas with women, the ambivalence is often present early on in a sexual experience, but it's not as noticeable,
Mhm.
which is
Well,
neither good
men
nor
can't
bad.
fake it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes, desire and arousal are not one and the same for women. There's a
Mhm.
gap.
Mhm.
And yet she has to get on board sort of as sexually relevant information is starting to present, and she's, but that's taking that, that's that foreplay that needs to happen at least like 15 minutes, 17 minutes, something like that, I think is ideal. But that that idea that it's like yes or no for him, and if
Mhm.
it's not working, then it's, pull the plug. Whereas with her, oftentimes it's not working because she needs a longer on-ramp.
Sure.
So it's interesting that sort of like he's held to a different standard, or, the reality is that it's a relational activity that
Mhm.
can zig and zag in different ways if the couple is willing to explore that.
Yeah.
And are your couples usually willing to explore that?
It varies. It's so all over the map, like some couples, and I find again, there's an age correlation here. The older the couple, usually the more protected the man feels about what sex is and means. And it's harder to convince them that there's other opportunities and that he's still viable, even if he can't, maintain attain or maintain an erection.
Yeah.
So those conversations vary depending on the personality, of the couple. But when they have different experiences, when they have pleasurable experiences, it starts to help change the narrative a bit
Mhm.
Yeah.
if they'll let it happen.
It's interesting. I've noted another thing I've noted, especially with older couples, is that the distinction that both men and women are often surprised by, actually, the distinction that's especially applicable more to women than to men between spontaneous arousal and responsive arousal,
Yeah.
which is often a surprise to a lot of women who will often say, if asked, I'm not sitting around thinking about it. I'm not saying, oh, gee, I'm wanting to have sex now. But when we get going, I actually enjoy it. And he turns out to be a good lover. It's like he's clueless, and so is she. And they're both feeling bad about it because and he's sitting around often thinking, well, it doesn't count if she's not initiating,
Right.
because after all, she doesn't really want it, even though she's saying, well, no, I don't think about it to initiate it. But once we get going, it's great. I love it. I love what it does for our relationship. I love what it does to you. It makes you happy. Those sorts of things have to be validated, it seems, with a lot of couples. And they worry that, oh no, our what we had early on, where both parties could barely keep their hands off each other, that's the only thing that's valid in terms of actually having a passionate sexual relationship. Is that something? Yeah, go ahead.
That definitely tracks. What I will say too is, the responsive desire is typically more the profile of the woman, where it
Mhm.
takes, I think everything is actually responsive desire. Even when it seems like it's spontaneous, they're still responding to something. It probably is just more subtle.
Mhm.
I don't know. But one way I found to kind of neutralize that dynamic, because I do hear that it's like they want to feel desired. And so it feels like, how do I get that? Is scheduled sex or scheduled intimate
Yes.
time, because it's hard to always be the initiator, and it's hard to always be like the person that has to respond to it, and you don't want to reject them. And so if like I've got a couple that have set aside Saturdays,
Mhm.
and we broadened it so it doesn't have to be sex, it can be just intimacy. It's time together that's focused, that's getting at some of those core needs, I think. And that has worked out better. So they
That
might
what
be
I've
doing
noted.
cards, they might be reading erotica, they might be doing sensate focus, they're doing different things in that time.
Mhm. Speaking of reading erotica, Judy has a book out. So
Oh, good. Oh, I'd
under
love
under
to.
her pseudonym Laria Zilber. Actually, you can hold up the book
All
for
right,
people who are seeing it.
definitely. Let me
We
know
can't
how
resist putting in a plug.
I'll add it to
One
my
moment.
library. All
There it is.
right.
The Blue Tent, Erotic Tales from the Bible.
Perfect. All
Yes.
right. I will take a look.
So that phenomenon of scheduling sex, I often find couples, their first reaction is awful. Oh, that's not valid. You can't do that. And or the woman is thinking, oh, that feels like pressure, and the man is feeling, well, that doesn't feel like she really wants me. He doesn't want to be a jerk. And when they can relax about that, and exactly as you say, they don't
Mhm.
have to do anything they don't want to do. Neither one is committing to something that they really don't feel like doing at that point. But they to set aside time where it's a possibility
Yeah.
takes a huge amount of pressure off. But it's a tough sell sometimes. Sometimes people are just horrified at that very prospect. It seems to invalidate it for them.
Yeah, it's interesting how resistant some people are to the idea of scheduling. So
Yeah.
what I typically say is if one person's open to it and one person's not, then the person that's open to it schedules it in their own mind and let it be a surprise for the other person.
That's a great way.
Put it on
That's a
your own
great way to do
calendar
it.
and see what happens. But yeah, it does neutralize some of that anxiety because once the anxiety is happening, then it can really derail. So I just feel like it's a good option. And I say, look, this is all a big experiment. Let's see what works for you.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Right.
Are you willing to try it? You know?
Can you tell us a little bit about your offering called the Pleasure Circle?
Yeah. So the Pleasure Circle launched beginning of last year, and it's in response to all of this because I wanted to sort of help more people than just the one-to-one. And so I've got a small group that I lead a couple times a year on Zoom. So, and that has historically been mostly for women. I have also done it with couples. I was hoping to initially do it with multiple couples, but I can't get any of the men to agree to tell their sex life in front of other men. It's so funny. So yeah, but in that it's a curriculum that I've developed and we go through history, we go through anatomy, we talk about toys, we talk about turn-ons and turn-offs. We do a lot of workshopping of stuff. So I give a little lecture each week and then writing prompts, and then we talk about it as a group. So it tends to be about 6 to 8 women. And that goes a couple times a year. I'm also working on a course that will be offline so people can do it at their own self-paced. So that should be out next year.
Mm.
And then I have a podcast that is all about sex and relationships. So, and then I'm writing articles and that type of thing. So I have, just content coming out.
Mhm.
Yeah.
How can people get in touch with you?
Probably the easiest way would be to go to my website that is about this material, which is pleasureproject.us. So
Pleasure-
from there, you can
Right.
pleasureproject.us. So you can
Right.
get to my podcast, you can sign up for my newsletter, you can look at my courses, there's quizzes, all of that is on that website. That's
Great.
easy.
Quizzes, huh? I gotta
Yeah,
take.
so I have a quiz that I created that is specifically looking at your attachment. What is your attachment style and how does that translate into sexual strategies?
Neat.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
interesting.
Does
Yeah.
attachment theory applied to this area?
Uh-huh. Yeah, we just recently interviewed someone who was all about attachment theory in particular, applied to couples therapy
So
more
how
generally.
does attachment theory apply to this?
Well, like an example would be if you think about the anxious profile and how that person tends to be pleasing, they tend to be looking outward, they tend to be anxious, and so erotically, that might be that they aren't super aware of their own needs. They are, relationally kind of staying focused on partner's pleasure and partner's needs at all costs. There might be some like clinging behavior that, they might be going erotically farther than they really want. They don't have a sense of self. They're very outward focused. So just kind of as a snapshot, that would be an example.
Mm-hmm. And for people like that, how would you help them? How would you help someone where that's their profile?
Yeah. So well, first of all, just even making them aware of how this all translates. Because once they have some awareness that that's what they're doing, oftentimes there's a lot of pursuing behavior in relationships. And so once they're aware that they're doing it, they can do something different, take contrary action, maybe resist the urge of calling or texting excessively, or maybe making their sexual need known. So asking for something and then resisting the urge to apologize, just like intervening in some basic ways and letting them have a new reparative experience so that they can start to have some rebalancing in the relationship. Because so much of this is just so automatic. So as opposed to like somebody who's avoidant, having them re-engage a bit more. The anxious person needs to stand down and the avoidant person needs to engage,
Mm-hmm.
typically in shorthand. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, it's been fun. I love having conversations with other therapists, and it's just nice to have that balance between you guys both having insight. Obviously, you've been in a relationship for a long time, so it's helpful.
Not that long.
We're
You would
new-
think because we're so old.
We're
that we
newlyweds,
would.
but we've been married 20 years, so I guess that's a while.
Oh, that's a while. That definitely counts.
That's a while. I think it's going to work. Well,
Good.
thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Welcome back. We hope you enjoyed that interview with Dr. Jenn Kennedy.
Indeed. And if you would like to be interviewed, or if you have just suggestions for someone who could be interviewed, or just suggestions for something you'd like us to talk about, Judy, how can people get in touch with us?
Ah, what a great question. We have a website. It's ctin7.com. That's ctin7, the number 7.com, CT as in couples therapy.
And yep, as a matter of fact, this very day when we happen to be recording this, got a question from a listener that we'll take up in another
In a
future interview.
A future show.
So, and we've done that in the past. We haven't been doing it that much recently.
No. In the beginning, we did a lot of
that, yeah.
questions.
But I do want to invite folks, if you have any questions you'd like us to address, anything of interest to you, feel free to submit it. I mean, if we think, oh, gee, this is not our area, maybe we won't use it. But more likely, if you think it's something you'd like to hear us talk about, by golly, we'll talk about it.
We will. And if you would like to be a guest on our show, you can. Did we already say that?
We said you can suggest yourself.
You can suggest, yes, you could,
And
yes.
what we didn't say yet is you can even sign up for a time. There is a
that's
scheduling
right.
link on our website, ctn7.com. I think we better stop now before we
I think
get
so.
completely confused. So until next time,
Remember, be kind
don't panic.
and have faith.